Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back to our final day. My name is Joel Hodge. I'm from the Australian Catholic University. I'm going to moderate this section, but I'm based in Princeton this semester, so I didn't come all the way from Australia. And we've got three great speakers who are going to speak to us this afternoon around the topic of martyrdom. So first up is a good friend of mine, Father Pilario, who is Dean and Professor at Adamson University's St. Vincent School of Theology. And you can read about his many degrees and interests in the program. He is a founding member and former president of the Catholic Theological Society of the Philippines. He's vice president of Concilium and editor of other philosophical and theological journals. He's an author of many books and articles, and most recently editor of a book that's just come out with Danny and myself and some others who are in this book on theology, conflict, and peace building. And he's also a Catholic priest who ministers in some interesting places in the Philippines, which you can read about in the program there too. So Danny is going to speak on rethinking martyrdom in the age of violent populism. So welcome, Danny.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bill, for inviting me to, and the Center for inviting me to this World Catholicism Week. I think this is my second or third time to be here in different rooms within this building. So thank you for your kind words, Joel, and thank you for coming, all the guests who are here and all the colleagues. I would like to especially mention my two converts who are here, Vincentian priests, Yui O'Donnell and Joe Floyd. Joe Floyd came all the way from New York just to attend the week, the Catholicism Week with us. The topic that I am asked to deliver this afternoon is about martyrdom. It's a very difficult topic, no? But I was thinking how to contextualize martyrdom today. And I entitled it, subtitled it, A Report from the Philippines. It's a little bit sad note that the report is a sad report from what's going on in the Philippines today. For those who want outlines, this slide is for you. Those who don't like outlines, never mind this one. But at least you would know what I would like to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes. We have a phenomenon in the Philippines now called the extrajudicial killings, which means these are summary killings done by state authorities, mainly the policemen, who just come into houses. If you're a suspected drug lord or a small-time drug seller, they will just, and if your name is on the list, they will just come into your house, single you out and shoot you right in front of your families and children. This is the recent statistics at the moment. There are already around 5,000 which are killed in drug-related police operations. This is an unofficial report and owned by the police itself. So the police said this is the number that we have killed in a police operation. Without the benefit of a judicial hearing or whatever, due process, there is no such thing. But beyond 5,000, you have what is now called the homicide under investigation, 22,900 or around 23,000, which are just summarily killed, not owned by the police, but maybe by police operatives also without uniforms. The other ones are with uniform and they have owned up to it. This one they call it homicide under investigation. This has been going on for 3 years now, and there is no investigation going on. So it's a misnomer, but that's a good name for actually just summary execution. In many NGOs, people who are counting the media, for instance, and other NGOs, we have been counting, there are around 33,000 now killed. Since our president, Duterte, took over from June 30, 2016 until now. 33,000 is our estimate until the end of 2018. So now we're like 6 months more that has been, and the number has been added. I would like to look at it as the context of the new process of rethinking martyrdom today. It's from the context of where I come from. I am a professor of theology from Monday to Friday, but on weekends I work in a garbage dump in Manila, the only garbage dump, the largest garbage dump, which is also a Vincentian parish. And so I have been there, like working there on weekends for the last 16 to 17 years of my life. So more or less I know the people there because I have been there every weekend. And in that small parish, we have around more than 100 who were killed. Fathers and sons. Many of them are parishioners and who come to the masses. And we just hear one day that they're dead. This is a first-hand experience. And one day, a filmmaker who is my friend asked me if she can come with me. And she said, I heard some things are going on in Payatas. Payatas is the name of the garbage dump. Can I come with you one Sunday? And I told her yes. And then she made this film. I show you a 9-minute documentary. This is with parental guidance. I hope you have asked permission from your parents. This is actually what happened. This is not film. She was following me on what I was doing that Sunday. And in one way or the other, this is her film.
Olivas Street. Si Fred yan.
Ay, ito na lang po nakabit.
Isa lang po natin, sir, ma'am.
Hindi man lang nagiinom yun eh.
Dati ko na sa watchlist daw, drugs watchlist daw. Totoo po ba yun?
Siguro kung ginagano nila siguro nila na para lumabas ganito, para lumabas lang masama yung bata.
Pero hindi totoo yun.
Wala, hindi totoo.
Hindi gumagamit sila.
Hindi gumagamit yun eh.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there is 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them.
Sa 32 kaso ng mga napatay sa gitna ng war on drugs na naimbestigahan ng Human Rights Watch, lumalabas na 24 ay kagagawan umano ng pulis. Lumabas din ng mga pulis ang responsable sa umano'y extrajudicial executions. Sinilip din ng grupo ang laging paggamit ng PNP sa rasong napatay ang isang suspect dahil nanlaban sa gitna ng buy-bust o anti-drug operation. Nataliwas naman sa halos isang kwento ng mga testigo na sumusuko na ang biktima pero pinagbabaril pa rin. Si Pangulong Duterte at iba pang mga opisyal ng pamahalaan maaari raw managot sa crimes against humanity na itinakda ng International Criminal Court kung saan kabilang sa kumikilala ang Pilipinas.
I started working in Payatas in 1990s as a young priest. I have been celebrating masses there every weekend since year 2002 hanggang ngayon.
Sige, Padre.
Noong linggo, nagmisa ako doon. Pagkatapos ng misa, usap-usapan, gano'n naman ako pagkatapos ng misa. Hindi ako umaalis, chika-chika doon sa mga nanay. And this Sunday was different. Kasi parang seryoso yung mga nanay at sinabi nilang, Father, nakakatakot na dito. Sabi ko, ano nangyari? Sabi niya, noong Webes lang, the Thursday before, 3 yung namatay dito.
Ang charger na lang po dahil sa pag-luto nito.
Sabi ng mga kaibigan niya dyan, huwag ka magpunta-punta dyan, Juan, kasi 0-0 ka. Eh sabi ko, ano ba yung 0-0? May putong na daw ang ulo ng anak ko. Nung mula noon, malis na yung anak ko nagtrabaho sa Maynila. Katapusan ng November, birthday nga ng apo ko. Sabi niya, Nay, luto ako spaghetti. Happy birthday, sabi niya kay Juan. Eh, itong mga bata, naglalaro sa kanya. Parang masaya siya ng mga anak niya. Kasi mapagmahal talaga din sa mga anak niya yun. Mamaya-maya konti, sabi ng mga tao, may putok na rito. Makaawa ko sa mga pulis. Huwag niyo naman sila.
Pero yung mga bata, nandoon sa labas?
Nandyan sa labas.
Pinalabas nila?
Pinalabas nila.
Pero yung isa, yung yumakap?
Yumakap. Binaklas pa rin ng pulis.
Ikaw yung nandito, di ba? Ikaw yung yumakap ka, di ba? Anong ang sinabi ng tatay mo nung bago sila pumasok nung pag-akap sa'yo? Pag-akap mo? Ngayon, basbasan natin si tatay ninyo para mag-goodbye tayo sa kanya. Nanay, kayo. Mga bata. Sabi ko ng papa mo. Ama namin sumasalangit pa, sambahin ang ngalan mo, mapasa amin ang kaharian mo, sundin ang loob mo, at huwag mo kaming ipahintulot sa tukso, at iadya mo kami sa lahat ng masama. Itong si Juan, at narinig ko lang ito sa nanay, at sa anak niya, bago siya binaril, nagmamakaawa pa siya. Sinabi niya, Sir, huwag niyo akong patayin kahit na magdusa ako sa kulungan buong buhay ko. Huwag mo na akong patayin kasi nakikita mo naman yung 7 kong mga anak. Sinong bubuhay niyan kung wala na ako? Alagaan mo yung mga bata.
Opo.
Pakayanin mo.
Sikapin ko po. Bigyan pa ako ng lakas ng Diyos sa edad ko na ito, Father. Nasabi ko kung hindi ko makakaya. Pero kayanin ko, Father, alang-alang sa mga anak. Nabili ng anak ko sa akin at sa mga apo ko.
My campaign against drug will not stop until the last pusher and the last drug lord are
pinagdarasal natin ang buong simbahan na sana ito'y maging malapit, lalong-lalo na sa mga biktima ng karahasan, ng lipunan.
Bigla na lang akong ginising ng mga kaibigan ko na. Tika-tika si tata na tukhang. Itakbo ako. Nadatang yung anak ko. Sa kasada bulagta na.
At makaawa pa raw mo yung asawa ko, tapos hindi rin pinakinggan. Tapos, hindi nila man lang naisip yung mga may iwan ng tao na papatayin nila.
Inisip ko na lang na paano kung walang mag-aalaga. Paano kaya yung mga apo ko na yan, napito yan na naiwan ng ama, yung inawala din. Kaya sa gabi-gabi, nanalangin na lang ako na bigyan ako ng lakas ng loob.
Nababahala ako sa mga taong namamatay. Natatakot ako sa mga pamilya nila, katulad ni Juan. Sinong bubuhay doon sa 7 niyang mga anak? Nababahala ako doon sa mga taong may kapangyarihan na basta-basta nalang kumikitil ng buhay. Sinong nagbigay sigla sa kanila ng karapatan?
Isa para sa lahat ng pinatay.
Panahon na ng simbahan na magsalita. Dahil kung hindi nagsasalita yung mga tao, sino pa ang magbibigay sa kanila ng lakas na magsalita?
The name of the victim is Juan, and he has 7 children. The eldest is in high school, but she is deaf mute. And the youngest was just born in prison. Because before Juan was killed, his wife was apprehended by the police. It happens like this. The police is in possession of a list of drug users and drug sellers. And then they go to these houses and identify who these persons are. The first time the police went into Juan's house, Juan was not there. So they captured his wife, who was like 8 months pregnant. And he has to stay without case in the prison for 1 year and 8 months. She delivered her baby in prison. She brought her back. He brought the baby back to the house. So now it's like he has 7 children. Of course, Juan left the place because he knew he was in the list. And the list would identify whether the lady says that the grandmother says 00 means for extermination. So he knows he was for extermination, and Juan avoided it. But when he knew that his wife was captured, he could not help it. He has 7 children there. In one of the birthdays of his children, he went home, brought some spaghetti, cooked them. And for people living in the garbage dump, spaghetti is real feast. So that morning at around 6 or 7, he cooked the spaghetti, fed his children. And after feeding the children, he's supposed to eat, then the police came in. They brought the children out, except there was one who was left, who was hugging her. They pulled her, but she was there in front. They shoot him one here, and then he begged for his life. They did not listen. They shoot him again, and he died in front of that small child. For 3 months, we have been journeying with these mothers. That child has not been speaking. She was just staring at you at nowhere. And the thing is, Juan, of course, avoided to be killed, but he could not help it. He has a family. He came home at night so that the police will not see. Yet, he was still detected and he died. And of course, according to his grandmother, that she's 86 years old, she's taking care of the 7 children and she doesn't know what to do. The situation in Payatas is interesting to many people. For instance, different fields like global narco-politics can talk about it. People are interested with resistance and resilience and risks among women survivors, for instance. It's also interesting to human rights community. For instance, recently we have sued the president at the International Criminal Court in Netherlands, and he withdrew the membership of the Philippines from the ICC. It's interesting also for pastoral interventions on resolving trauma, economic response to the death of the breadwinners, but also for the access to the justice system. It's difficult because they could not go to the police because the police were the ones who killed them. They could not go to the courts because the courts are controlled by the present government. So where are they going? But this morning, I would like to reflect on it about the situation in terms of the case of martyrology or the martyrdom case. There are 2 narratives of martyrdom in the early Christian history. There are 2 stories of martyrs. One is from above, from those who hold power, from the view of the empire. Martyrs are criminals, they're threats to the existing social order, they're disobedient to the laws of the state. This is the case of the present government's interpretation of the drug addicts, the drug sellers. But there is a narrative of from below, from persecuted Christians themselves, people who lived faithful, there were people who lived faithful lives, and for which they were killed, and for which they were honored. This is the view of the mothers, of the wives, of the orphans. They were loving fathers. They came home, risked their life for the spaghetti. It's in this question that I would like to reinterpret martyrdom from this context. There are a lot of ways with which we look at martyrdom. For instance, odium fidei, hatred of the faith. Christianity as threat to the empire, therefore confession of the faith is the main sign of martyrdom. It's a dominant feature of the account of martyrdom. Cases of Polycarp, Apollonius, Cyprian, Felicity, etc. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, it's odium conscientia, hatred of conscience. No? Denial of individual conscience when Christianity became the dominant power as part of the narrative of the empire. People who challenge the wielding of dominant power are the martyrs of these times, like Joan of Arc, Janus, Thomas More, etc. Recently, John Sobrino, for instance, it's odium justitia, hatred of justice, death as culmination of a life of praxis of justice. According to him, there are material and formal conditions of martyrdom. Material is violent death. Formal condition is the following of Christ, which culminated in death. But Sobrino also said about odium amoris, in hatred of love. And for me, I see here a violent death, culmination of life lived for the love of God and neighbor. And I see here an opening to the thing that I would like to forward. There are contemporary martyrs whose lives are far from prominent lives of Romero and Bonhoeffer, whose death maybe are not dramatic, whose lives were so ordinary and commonplace, whose lives were not heroic, but just the same met violent deaths as they expressed their commitment and fidelity to their families and friends. Here I am thinking of the victims of the Philippine War on drugs. Many of them were ordinary sons and fathers, just working with meager incomes for their families. Some of them were not even pious or staunch defenders of the faith, yet their violent deaths were signs of their Christian love for their neighbors their families, and their narratives are endless if we collect them. This is what I call the martyrs at the sites. There are non-heroic martyrs, people who did not court martyrdom but whose lives ended in violent death themselves. I would like to refer to what is called the voluntary martyrdom debate present in contemporary literature. For instance, these authors, like Sankroa, thinks that there was a substantial number of martyrs who were enthusiastically offering their lives, singing as they were while they were fed to the lions. And this case, like these were told to us in our spiritual readings, like they were so happy going to the mouth of the lions. And according to Sankroa, this aggravated and provoked more persecution. However, there is a debate because on the other side, according to Lorraine Bach, he says, no, a good number were just doing what they were expected to do, like caring for the sick, visiting the prisoner, feeding the hungry, solidarity with the victim. These were called everyday martyrs. I have here like a quotation, an information from Eusebius, the early Christian historian, and he said, Theodosia, for instance, was arrested when she saluted some confessors and asked them to remember her in their prayers. Dionysius was beheaded after he attended to 6 voluntary martyrs prior to their deaths. Agapius was denounced to the governor when he made frequent trips to Gaza, to Caesarea, to visit his brother in prison. Ares was condemned to the flames, and Probius and Elijah were to the sword, when upon being questioned at the gate of Ascalon, they admitted they were taking food to the confessors in Cilicia. Indeed, all these martyrs and many others attracted attention to themselves by doing nothing more than just what is expected of them. Indeed, it was these very acts of charity, compassion, and cohesion that set Christianity apart from paganism, especially during the times of adversity, and made it an attractive option. An example is the Emerenciana. Emerenciana is the daughter of the nanny of St. Agnes, murdered, killed, martyred, 300, circa 300. She was not even a Christian. She was a catechumen. And she was so sad that her friend, Agnes, was murdered. She went to the tomb. And just by being there, she was murdered. This is the case of baptism by fire. But for me, this is the case. An ordinary martyr was not intending, was not offering her life. She was just doing what is expected of a friend. I think this is what is meant by martyrs in the name of love and compassion. These and other martyrs, including Juan and those ordinary fathers and young men in the Philippines, are what I call martyrs at the side. They do not seek martyrdom but practice in their ordinary lives the Christian virtue of compassion and fidelity, for which they were killed. In conclusion, I would like to make sense of what many people today, in the context of populist regimes, call senseless killings. These people did not die in the name of grand narratives of their fight for justice and heroic causes of universal importance. There is sense in ordinary expressions of love, small narratives of everyday justice. One Latin American theologian says on poquito de justicia, it's most often hesitatingly, but not violent deaths just the same. Second, I would like to recover the meaning of the lives of the many others in some and parallel contexts, not just in Payatas. For instance, the fathers shot at the Mexican border, trying to make life easier for their families in Mexico. Or a teacher who offered her life for her students, which we talked about yesterday in America, but also in southern Mindanao. Teachers were killed in the process. Indigenous peoples who defend their ancestral domains for the future of these families. These people are not known. They don't fight for grand narratives of justice. But that is why in this context I would like to rethink martyrdom. But lastly, for us to recover the quotidian character of martyrdom. And this is Rowan Williams. To appreciate in the life of in the martyrial key, and that is to live our baptismal challenge in a non-dramatic manner of quotidian existence. That's my intention of rethinking martyrdom today. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny, for that very moving presentation. We'll have time for questions afterwards. So our next speaker, Maria Clara Bingemer, who is a well-known Brazilian theologian from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, is going to speak to us on Christian nonviolence for secular causes, the case of two 20th century religious communities. And Maria Clara focused her research in systematic theology and particularly contemporary mysticism and Latin American and liberation theology. And she's published a number of different works there, which is listed in the biographies in the sheet provided. She's a former dean of the Center of Theology and Human Sciences at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and held the first Duffy Lectures chair at Boston College, and serves on a number of editorial boards of theological journals, including Concilium. So I invite and welcome her to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank very much Bill and this center, where I have been many times already, for this invitation. I thank Danny for the impressive presentation. And let's try to continue to reflect on that category of martyrdom today. So that's what I'm trying to do. First, Christianity is a religion that has an original view of secularity. Jesus' gospel moves the center of faith from the sacred space, the temple, to the world and to people, the reality of creation and of flesh. Christianity is the religion of the Word made flesh. Paul refers to the community of Christians as the body of Christ. The boundaries of that body are rarely clear, for the Holy Spirit is not confined to the visible church, but the center of that body is the weakest members of it. Paul says they are the indispensable ones, the people who Danny showed us in this presentation before, the poor, the vulnerables. And when one member suffers, all suffer together. Christ identifies himself with the victims of this world. So the church is that community that undoes the logic of violence by breaking the forces that proclaim the guilt of the victims, unmasking the scapegoating mechanism. So nonviolence is at the core of Christian life. And it is not for a few heroic individuals. It's something that is lived in community by sensing the deep interconnection of all people sharing the same spiritual experience. So the Christian church is called to be a community of witnesses who live every day the challenge of love and nonviolence. Siding with the victims of the world provoke opposition. Christians of all time faced opposition and suffered martyrdom. So martyrdom has been considered through the history of Christian tradition as the ultimate witness to the truth of nonviolence. It's not merely an ancient phenomenon, but a daily reality for Christians around the world today. bearing witness of the coming kingdom. But the martyrs are not alone. Their witness depends on a church community ready to keep their memory alive as a proclamation of what God's creation really like. So here we will present the case of two religious communities of the 20th century. The Jesuits of the Catholic University of El Salvador, murdered in November '89, and the Trappist community of Tibirin, Algeria, kidnapped on March 27, 1996 and killed 2 months later on May 21st. We will try to show that the supreme testimony can happen not only for religious causes, the dogmas, the keeping of the tradition, not to praise the emperor, to refuse to deny truth, the faith truth, but by love to this world and to the creatures created by God, for the people living in this world. On November 16, 1989, the church and the world received the news of the execution of a whole Jesuit community at the UCA in San Salvador. The capital was a small country named El Salvador in Central America. The murder was executed by the battalion Atlacat, elite troop of the Salvadoran army. On the occasion were killed the rector of the university, Father Ignacio de Curia, and 5 other Jesuits, Segundo Montes, Ignacio Martín Baró, Ignacio López y López, Juan Ramón Moreno, y Amando López, who were at the residence, and 2 women, a mother and her daughter, Julia Elba Ramos y Celina Ramos, who worked at the service of the university and residence. One member of the community, the theologian John Sobrino, survived because of being at that moment in Thailand. On May 21st, 1996, a communique, a message sent by the JIA, radical Islamic group, announced the death of 7 Trappist monks, the whole community of Notre-Dame de l'Atlas, in the mountains of Tibirin, Algeria. They were the prior, Christian Le Chergé, Christophe Le Breton, who was the novice master, Brother Luc Dauchier, a physician, who was monk, Brother Michel Fleury, Father Bruno Le Marchand, Célestin Rangeard, and Brother Paul Favre-Miville. The monks were kidnapped on March 27, 2 months before. They were beheaded, and the JIA blamed the French government for not being able to negotiate the liberation of some Muslim prisoners in France in order to liberate the monks. 2 of the monks, Father Jean-Pierre and Father Amédée, survived because they were not found by the kidnappers in the monastery. The government found, and the superiors recognized, only the heads of the monks. The bodies were never found. That's why there is a doubt who killed them, if the Islamic radical group or the Algerian army. Even with different charisms, those 2 communities have traits in common. They are both Christian communities, therefore church cells. They belong to 2 religious orders of the Catholic Church, the Trappists and the Jesuits. The Trappists have, besides the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, a vow of stability, which attached them to the same monastery for the rest of their lives. The Jesuits make a special vow of obedience to the Pope for everything related to mission. So being similar, with those similarities, they are different also. One is contemplative, the Trappist, and lives in the cloister. The other is active, and isn't attached to anything but mission. Nevertheless, both knew a very similar violent death, and are considered by the Church as martyrs, which means witnesses, even if they are not officially canonized. Both the Tibetan Trappist communities and the Jesuits of El Salvador lived a community lifestyle a little different from that of other communities in their religious order. And this difference brings them closer in spite of difference. This lifestyle was extended and eccentric. They welcomed and recognized as members people who did not belong to the religious order itself. In the case of the Trappists, those outsiders are the inhabitants of the village that surrounded the monastery, who were not even Christians, but Muslims. The same for all those linked together by the same ideals of dialogue and peace, either Christians or Muslims. The Tibetan community then had concentric circles because it was an eccentric community, meaning to say a community that didn't find its beginning, middle, and end in itself, and in the life of its nuclear members, but which understand its life and its vocation as service to the others. In the case of the Jesuits, of El Salvador, something similar happens. They have a common mission with very clear objectives to put their knowledge and wisdom at the service of the poor and oppressed Salvadoran reality. Inspired by liberation theology, the community of the UK, in fact, presents the profile described by one of the exponents of liberation theology, the Peruvian priest Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez says that community is defined and motivated by a common commitment developed in a way that integrates differences in reflection and practice. His concept justifies being a community of people sharing a common praxis, but bringing very different traditions and perspectives to support interpretation of this practice. Those might be liberalism, Marxism, or other different religious traditions, reflecting a common fundamental choice and ultimately a community. According to the statements of Gutierrez in Medellin, the current problem of the church is not so much people who do not believe in God, but people who do not practice their faith. Actions are a more authentic expression of fundamental choice than words. A plural and multiform unity of gestures and attitudes is definitely more significant than a unity based only on common professions of faith. The community led by the bright philosopher and thinker Ignacio Ellacuría never ceased to open new doors to dialogue, not only with ecclesial, but academic, civil, and political sectors. This dialogue has enriched their positions, the positions of the community, reinforcing, and of the university, reinforcing and expanding the role of the Jesuit community beyond campus, in the city, in the country, in the world. And it reinforced the idea that not only the Jesuit priests wanted an end to injustice and violence in El Salvador. Many other people and groups, religious or non-religious, supported the critical and utopian position of the Rector Ellacuría and his community, and they expanded their strength and their historical and political repercussion. This is what Gutierrez thinks and writes when he states that despite the differences within such a group, their common praxis provides the necessary basis for a meaningful and productive reflection on this praxis. I quote, "Only a sufficiently broad, rich and integrated revolutionary praxis with the participation of people from different points of view can create the conditions of a fruitful theory. One of his major concerns, especially is the beginning of his theological trajectory, is the dialogue between Marxists and Christians fighting together in moments and revolutionary situations, without ever assuming the Marxist principles, and assuming not that Marxists will eventually become Christians or vice versa. He sees Christian theology transform as a result of the contact between Christians and martyrs who strive for a better world and live consistently with it." The spiritual eccentricity of the two communities roots in the distinction so dear to Vatican II and to liberation theology, the theological difference between the Church and the kingdom of God. There is a priority of the kingdom of God over the church. According to the theologian, the Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff, I quote, "The church is that part of the world which in the power of the Spirit has embraced the kingdom, explicitly in the person of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, incarnated in oppression, who keeps the permanent memory and conscience of the kingdom, celebrates its presence in the world and in itself, and holds the grammar of its proclamation in the service of the world. The world is the place of the historical realization of the kingdom, and the kingdom, which encompasses the world and the church, is the good end of the totality of creation in God, at last totally liberated from all imperfection and penetrated by the divine that realizes it absolutely." Tibetan's monastic community experienced and understood that the best way to carry out their vocation of contemplatives was to be prayerful among prayerful, and not only among Christian prayerfuls, but of other denominations. Thus they understood to realize the communion of the saints that so much inspired and attracted the mystic prior Christian de Cherché. It has not been favorably seen by some, this freedom to move mystically and prophetically across the boundaries of religious differences. And although the poor, the humble, the Muslim people who knew and loved the monks welcomed and participated fully in this evangelical and pioneering experience, it was not so for others, for the terrorist radical groups, or even the Algerian army and the government. The Jesuit community at UCA had a similar experience. Instead of self-understanding only as a theoretical academy who sees knowledge as an end in itself, they opened up university and mission to other segments of society, even if they did not share their reading of reality. So, they were leading not only quality knowledge and state-of-the-art education in the country and Central America, but they led a political process that wanted to be liberating and to contribute to a serious breakthrough. Both paid the price for their visibility and choice, and that price was their violent death, their martyrdom. What's the sense of that martyrdom? First, they were both revolutionary, each in his own style, according to each one's charisma and spirituality. They lived in different ways from the usual model of religious community. Second, they brought something new about how to live consecration to God and others. Both were inspired by the news brought by the Second Vatican Council and assumed by the whole Church. Tibirin demonstrated the commitment till the end with interreligious dialogue. They lived in a country where the religion of the other was majority, and their monastic vocation was put in close dialogue and deep communion with this other tradition. The Jesuits of the UCA did the same with the option for the poor. Although assumed by Latin American Church, they found a way to live that option as an intellectual community. They turned an entire university towards this option, responding to questions that came up from reality. Third, both communities were embedded in a concrete reality, but with universal openness. Their realities were Algeria, and by extension the Middle East, and El Salvador, a strategic point in Central America. Both contexts were windows to the world. Fourth, both communities accepted the challenge of staying rooted where they were in spite of danger and threat. They have not withdrawn or escaped driven by fear of bearing the consequences of their choices, even if they had the possibility to do so. 5. Both communities were sustained by a deep spirituality. The whole process they lived until their death was prayed, discerned, worked in community, both ad intra and ad extra, within diversity and dealing with it. 6. Both communities had a remarkable leader ahead of them. Christian de Chergé and Ignacio de Curia were spiritual men, bright intellectuals with a broad and prophetic vision. Their charism was fundamental for the communities to engage so deeply in these projects that responded to the context in which they were located. 7. Both communities wanted to bring peace amidst conflict, injustice, and violence. Even if violence seems to have had the last word with them, their gestures, words, lives, testimony remain victorious over violence. They are witnesses of nonviolence. 8. Both communities' legacy can be lived by every Christian in any context, in any state of life. To be prayerful not only with Christians, but with other faiths and religions. To live simply among the poor and at their service, receiving from them friendship, forgiveness, inspiration, experiences, and questions that guide reflection and theory. To practice in the extreme the evangelical principle of nonviolence, reacting to evil with good, love, and peace. They were killed in dialogue until the end, never closing off or taking any more explicit defensive action. To face death with the style of Jesus Christ, resilient under threat, praying and discerning the possibility of martyrdom, making decisions to stay and remaining faithful to their commitment even with death as a very close horizon. The legacy of the martyrdom, the theological legacy of the martyrdom. First is a call to attention to what is essential. It is not so much the rules, the irreproachable and radical following of the principles, and what is written in the books and records of the religious order or congregation. The essential thing is to live the gospel, to be a group of people who closely follow the radical way of life of Jesus. And so they open and are ready to develop loving and dialogical relationships with all people, cultures, and traditions. In the midst of the secularity and plurality of the world today, Christianity is called to enter into this diversity and from there give its testimony. It is a testimony that surprises the world. Why did the two communities shook public opinion and surprised the world? Partly because it surprised everyone where the testimony resonated. From a social-political, economic context and not so much ecclesial in the case of the Jesuits. From a multi-religious context or even a society with theocratic characteristics, as was the case with the Tibetan monks. The issues that brought about the radical engagement of both communities were secular and pluralistic issues, not only theological or religious ones. In the case of the Jesuits, this was clearly visible. The community wanted to be an instance of prophetic denunciation against an oppressive and unjust government following in the footsteps of Monsignor Romero. From the Areopagus of the university, the Jesuits turned their study, their research, their teaching, and their activities of extension for the transformation of this unjust context where they lived. But they also added to this the insertion among poor communities in the periphery. Almost all of them worked alongside these communities spread on the outskirts of the capital of El Salvador, and from there preached the gospel and helped transform reality. With the monks, the space was not a university, but a monastery. However, they made this explicitly religious space a place of openness to the poorer communities in the neighborhood. They were provided with services of all kinds, not just religious services. The tireless Brother Luke attended at times more than 150 patients per day. For his part, the prior Christian de Chargé created a movement that involved the religious and laity, Christians and Muslims, to pray and work together in peace building. By acting in a religious way, prayer, but also universal peace building, they witnessed it was possible to transform the society where they lived. Their martyrdom is a community liturgy. The martyrdom of the two communities has the status of a liturgy. Such was martyrdom generally in the early days of Christianity, a public event with characteristics of celebration. The martyrs were displayed in open space to the whole population, such as the Roman circus or the streets of the city or the roads in the outskirts of the cities, given in spectacle to the people. They were oblations of the liturgy of the Roman Empire, which preached the cult to the emperor. In fact, the martyrs made visible to the world and in the eyes of all Jesus and what he represented, that is, the kingdom of God already happening here and now. Their lives were lived for the purpose, and their deaths are a consequence of that. This liturgy is indeed Eucharistic, for the martyrs and their testimony are food for all who can witness their death, as well as for those who kill them. One can recall here Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, a 2nd century martyr, who says, I want to be food, understanding himself in Eucharistical terms. I am God's wheat, and I shall be ground by the teeth of beasts, that I may become the pure bread of Christ. The consequence of this will be the distribution of Christ in person by and for the people. The communities themselves live this Eucharistic vocation, visibilized liturgically and actually realized, and it's worth remembering the word written by the monk Christophe Le Breton about the configuration of his community while they live that expectation of what was going to happen to them. He uses the Greek word which describes the liturgical moment of the consecration, when the Spirit changed bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ to feed all the people, the word epiclesis. He wrote, we are a community in state of epiclesis. What do those communities teach us as Christians today? They teach us a way to be truly human. So there is an anthropological teaching there. There is a deep anthropological significance in the testimony of these two communities. In a historical and cultural moment in which human beings seem to have become synonymous with possessing, consuming, they teach that being human is, on the contrary, giving, offering, opening to the other and commit to him or her, being faithful to the end to this surrender. In this sense, rather than consuming, being human is being consumed, to use the title of the very good book of Bill Kavanagh. Also a Christological path. Being human is to be governed by otherness, by the epiphany of the face of the other. Christian de Chergé, a profound connoisseur and disciple of Emmanuel Levinas, applied and taught this to his brothers. Elia Curia, brilliant philosopher, introduces the centrality of otherness from the concept of reality of his master Zubiri, reality from which one must take charge and carry, announcing there the kingdom of God. In fact, it is the path of Jesus Christ himself that is manifested through those who follow him. The murdered Jesuits are intellectuals who did not close themselves in the laboratories or only acted in classrooms. They went to meet the poor in their communities, and they learned a new way of thinking, celebrating, and living. They entered into communion with otherness, as did Jesus of Nazareth. The Tiberine Trappist community make this path even more explicitly. Being a Catholic contemplative community, they do not hesitate to walk to meet the Muslims, to pray with them, to be with them. They do this in Jesus' style, who is open to revelations from foreigners considered idolaters, like the Syrophoenician or the Samaritan, who allows the touch of impure and sinful women without fear of contamination, who praises the behavior of publicans, who can teach those who consider themselves elected, who opens the doors of his kingdom to all those who seek God with a sincere heart, opening the space of the monastery for Muslims to pray, going to meet these brethren of another faith to pray with them, welcoming them into their personal and communal space, giving their lives to the end for them. The Tiberine monks testify to a radical following of Jesus. It is an inclusive following of Jesus that the two communities live and proclaim. Also, they teach a way to be church. Both communities also show an ecclesiological path. They teach and seal with their blood the style of being church that can be a teaching for the whole church. In the case of the UCA, the proposed church model has already been linked to liberation theology. The Jesuit community of El Salvador was in line with this project and this model of the church. It is a church that conceives itself more horizontal and less vertical, more centered on the people than on the hierarchy. In addition, it is a church focused on the poor as its pastoral and missionary priority. This church continues to exist in Latin America, fueled by the popular reading of the Bible, by pilgrimage and walks that draw attention to the situation of the excluded, by popular movements against injustice committed by various autocratic and elitist governments. The model of church revealed by the Tiberine communities also has the element of solidarity with poor and excluded. It was clearly out of solidarity with the poor that the monks did not leave the monastery, hoping to help and protect with their permanence those who could not leave, who were there were not being allowed to leave, who were also threatened by violence. But above all, they show a model of the church that is humbly aware of not holding the monopoly of the truth, but sharing with other traditions which name God differently. What was happening in the monastery of Tiberine was a trans-religious ecclesial community, which at the same time lived deeply its Christian and Catholic identity, while permeable to all the richness of dialogue with another tradition. It is a community that even allows itself to be shaped by the relationship with other traditions and religion. Today we see other examples and cases that follow Tiberine's model, at the same time renewing and reconfiguring it. We can remember here Thésée, an ecumenical monastery founded by Brother Roger, which attracts thousands of young people throughout the world. Also initiatives like the monastery of Bos in Italy, whose prior Enzo Bianchi is one of the exponents of the ecumenical dialogue. So was the monastery founded by the Italian Jesuit Paolo Dall'Olio in Syria, who gathered for prayer sharing people from the three monotheistic traditions. His mysterious disappearance for several years does not prevent the seed he planted of trans-religious prayer continue to bear fruit in various parts of the Middle East and universally irradiating the spirit of interreligious dialogue. The spirit of Tiberine is alive and continues to be present in the Church of Christ, which has opened up more and more in the last pontificates and in a very special way in the pontificate of Pope Francis for a universal communion without borders. Also the deep and true meaning of martyrdom. The martyr receives martyrdom as a gift. Violent death by fidelity to Jesus Christ and His gospel can be accepted but not sought. This is the difference with others who accept both to die and to kill. It is not the death of the kamikaze, nor of the suicidal or the bomber, nor of Socrates, who quietly drinks his poison before his disciples, uttering wise words. The martyr does not get out of his way and doesn't lose his lucidity about the story he has been given to live from within his faith, the same as Jesus of Nazareth. Finally, to read the signs of times. Both communities respond, inspired by the Spirit of God, to the challenges of time. They are, as the Second Vatican Council wants, attentive readers to the signs of times that reveal where the will of God passes in this time and space we live in. And they have, as background of their lives and their martyrdom, witnessed the presence and the revelation of God, paradoxically verified in the impotence and failure of the cross. The fruits of their testimony will spread like seeds to the wind, fallen on good soil, or they will be distributed to feed the hungry for truth, love, and meaning for life. The time of Easter will inevitably come. Apparently, the prisons, hammers, nails, knives, and bullets destroy everything. But in reality, they always arrive late, because the word is already sown in many generous and fruitful wombs. These wombs are those of men and women who receive the testimony and bring it to bear fruit, or the earth that opens its fruitful womb to receive the seed that will later become a leafy and turgid fruit tree. Those ecclesial communities show us today what the whole church is called to be.
Thank you very much, Mia Clara. That was some great reflections on martyrdom, on contemporary martyrdom. Now we turn to our third and final speaker. Ernesto Valiente is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. His main areas of interest are political and liberation theology and theologies of social reconciliation, and he's published on the Christological spirituality of John Sobrino. He's also the former chair and current vice chair of Christians for Peace in El Salvador, and he is going to speak on Christian martyrdom, Jesus' self-giving, non-violent response to a violent world. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the invitation to the center. This is also my second time here. I've been inching my way towards nonviolence in the last couple of years. Actually, in theology, my first interest was liberation theology, and liberation theology led me to the notion of reconciliation, and reconciliation is leading me towards nonviolence, so everything is moving with some degree of order. In this presentation, what I want to do is basically offer you a Christological reading of martyrdom. So in a way, this complements very well with the excellent presentations of Danny and Maria Clara. Okay, so my emphasis is going to be on Jesus and why we say that Jesus is a martyr. So I am going to talk about the relationship between cross and martyrdom. Okay, the cross and martyrdom have always occupied a significant place in the Christian tradition. We know that. These two terms remind us that our faith is lived out in a violent world. They unveil the frightful but real dimension of Christian discipleship in a dangerous and conflicted world. But cross and martyrdom have generated polyvalent and at times conflictual interpretations. So that's the first thing that I wanna address as an introduction only. If you go to any Christian church today, outside from a theological seminary, most of the people, many of the people in the pew are going to tell you that Jesus died because somehow Jesus' death was necessary to satisfy for our sins. Okay? And that question came up yesterday, I think. Most of us very well, we talked about this yesterday, that we don't believe, theologians do not endorse this idea anymore. And as a matter of fact, here, feminist theologians have been very important in addressing this. Dolores Williams says that that type of cross presents no word of salvation for African American women. Rita Nakashima-Brock says, are you sure that God did that? Is God a child abuser? So in the last 30 years, then, what we have is a re-understanding of the cross, to the point that we have theologians like Edward Skilvex making a comment like this. You know, we are not redeemed thanks to the death of Jesus, but despite of it. So, we begin to see already a conflict in the understanding of the cross. Is it salvific? Is it not? Did it happen? Did it happen or not? Something similar happens with martyrdom. During the first 300 years, and then you already talked about this, during the first 300 years of Christianity, a martyr was described as one who witnessed and died for Jesus. Yet this basic link between martyrdom and the imitation of Christ, I think, has slowly eroded through time. For me, especially at the time of the Counter-Reformation, when the emphasis was placed not so much on the practice of the faith, but on the purity of understanding our faith, of the purity of doctrine. Nowadays, we have a threefold criteria, basically, that is used by the church. The one that you have there. A martyr freely accepts their death. Their death is both violent and caused by hatred of the faith. This odium fidei is very important for the church. And I think it has been overstressed. Okay? And it refers to more of a dogmatic understanding of martyrdom. Now, this has begun to change. In 1980, after the death of Monsignor Romero, Karl Rahner published a very short but fantastic article where he says, why cannot Romero be a martyr when his pursuit of justice was rooted in the gospel? And eventually, thanks to Francis, the church listened, and now we have a martyr and a saint. But there are also other theologians that sometimes now they argue, well, what about those who in those struggle for justice, they took up arms? Are they martyrs? We had that wonderful conversation yesterday about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, So my point of the proposals, the very modest proposals that I want to make are these. One, that while the cross and martyrdom are rich and polyvalent symbols, I suggest that from the Christian perspective, they are best understood, and I stress from the Christian perspective, this is from our church, they are best understood by looking at Jesus' context, life, and particularly looking at the manner in which he engaged his conflicted world. And second, like Danny, I believe that we need a new understanding of martyrdom rooted in Jesus' life, death, that responds to our situation today. So let's begin. Our point of departure then is going to be Jesus of Nazareth and the context of Jesus. And I'm going to emphasize those aspects that I believe are important to deal with the idea of martyrdom and that explain the cross. The first thing is that we have to remember that Jesus' land was under the control of the Roman Empire. And how after Herod's death, you have the north controlled by Philip, Herod Antipas controlled Galilee and Perea, and Herod Archelaus was in charge of Judea, but he was not able to maintain order. So there was an insurrection, a rebellion a small rebellion, and he was replaced by a Roman prefect. That's why eventually we're going to have Pontius Pilate. Okay? Now, the job of these puppet kings were basically three, very simple. To protect the borders, maintain the order and the stability of the region, and make sure that they were collecting the tax. Rome gave them free hands to them. Now, this, as you can see, I'm using a lot of scripture scholars. I'm not a scripture scholar, but I think the ones that I have chosen are pretty good. So William Herzog describes Palestine at the time of Jesus as an unjust agrarian society dominated by the Roman Empire. As you can see, the first thing that you notice in that chart is that there is no middle class. Okay? At the top, the ruling elites represented 1 or 2% of the population, and this included the rulers, their court, and the family of the chief priests. Also, they usually live in the cities. Then you have also part of that upper class, what is called the retainers, the bureaucracy that serve the ruling elite. And here we have the temple officials, the tax collectors, the lawyers, the clerks of the tolls, large merchants. Okay? And then at the bottom, you have the remaining 92% that consisted mostly of rural peasants, fishermen, artisans, who struggled to survive under conditions of oppression. Now, because the land was the main source of revenue and employment, social stratification was at this time largely a function of land ownership. So what we have then is a relationship between two groups, mostly the urban elites, the owners of the land who do not live on the land, but rented out the land, and exploited the land. Okay? So my point here is that we, as Marcus Borg says, we live under conditions of economic exploitation. Okay? I have some quotes here for some important scripture scholars. James Dunn explains that the small landlords and leaseholders live under the threat of losing their holding due to the triple tax structure. These are the different types of taxes that the people have to pay. Then Richard Hoslia adds that taxation among the agricultural producers amounted to well over 40% of their production. And then Gerard Thyssen, I think, makes kind of the conclusion of this quick argument that Jewish Palestine was riven by deep structural tensions, by tensions between Jews and Gentiles, town and country, rich and poor rulers and ruled. And there are other sources of conflict in addition to that. The division between the different parties, the policy of, or the idea of ritual purity that created a lot of tension. My point is that when Jesus comes, and when Jesus is going to be the preaching to his people, this is not, like John Sobrino says, this is not a neutral landscape. This is not a harmonious landscape. He's already preaching in a situation of deep conflict. Okay? Now, the message of Jesus then, I am not going to just call it, and everybody knows that at the center of his ministry was God's reign, the reigning of God. But you know what? I think we should call it a reconciling kingdom, because it's a message that comes to overcome a situation of enmity. Okay? In fact, at the time of Jesus, people have divided the history like in two parts. On this first part, in which they were living, the present time was the time in which Israel was under the Roman occupation. The wicked flourished. Israel disobeyed the law. Situations were not well, okay? But there was this promise, and the promise is that there will come a time when God would no longer have God's face. In this new world order that is promised with the kingdom, God will assume his kingship and overcome his enemies. The land will be cleansed of Gentile population, and God, and this is very important, God will pour out his spirit in such a way that Israel will keep the law from their heart. So this proclamation of the kingdom is a good news in the midst of bad things. To put it shortly, it's a reconciling kingdom. Now, with Jesus comes the kingdom. But as you know, kingdom is not fully here yet. And this is when we say that God needs me. Yesterday in another presentation by me, it also makes the point, God needs time. The kingdom doesn't come at once. So we live in this intermediate time. The other characteristic of the kingdom that is very important is that the kingdom is not ours. The kingdom is God's project. We do not earn it nor deserve it. It's a gift. But one of the things that we can see in Jesus is that we are invited to collaborate in that kingdom. We cannot stay sitting in our bones, but we have to respond to that invitation of the kingdom. Okay? So in that sense, the kingdom is our gift and our task. So the kingdom is really the reigning of God, when God will be in control. But it also speaks about a reconciled eschatological community, a communion rooted in God's merciful justice, where the victims of history will be restored to life. So we do need to say over and over that the kingdom comes first to those who suffer, that the kingdom comes first to the poor, the excluded. And we see that in the miracles. We see that in the relationships of Jesus. It's everywhere in the gospel. At the same time, the fact that there is a preferential option for the poor does not mean that this kingdom is exclusive. And we see that in the way that Jesus relates to everybody, but especially to the sinners. We see that in the table fellowship. We see that in the way that Jesus deals with the sinners. Again, I'm always thinking about Zacchaeus. And what I like about this image of Zacchaeus is because the welcoming of Jesus comes first. First is the welcoming of Jesus, and then you have repentance. The scripture scholar Ben Mayer says basically the same thing, talking about the table fellowship shows that conversion follows communion. Why? Because grace is always first. We have to put ourselves out there first. And God, this kingdom too, calls for a reversion of values. It calls from our conversion. Somebody was talking, many people were talking about this yesterday. We need a new imagination, a new way of understanding the world. And we have certain parables that kind of give us a glimpse of that. The workers in the vineyard, when the guy who comes at 5 o'clock gets paid the same as the one who comes at 8 o'clock in the morning. The actions of the Good Samaritan. The idea that the last will be first. Things are going to change tremendously. This civilization of wealth that Eyakuria calls, this is not it. Okay? We need a new imagination, a new way of thinking. There is also an emphasis that the kingdom comes with a transformation of our heart. that that in somehow we can begin to live as members of the kingdom already. Okay? And this is clear in the Sermon of the Mount. A new way of living. And here I want to make this emphasis. We always emphasize the message of the kingdom, the features of the kingdom, but we rarely speak about the spirit of the kingdom. Jesus not only saved us, but it is important, I think, to remember or to pay attention on how Jesus saves, the manner, the way of proceeding of Jesus. Okay? If there is going to be a confrontation, what is the manner of that confrontation? So, because of this new heart that we have received, Jesus invites his disciples to become peacemakers who mercifully thirst for justice, reject violence, and accept persecution. Accept that persecution is part and parcel of the kingdom way. It's a spirituality. It's a new way of being in the world. I prefer to think, when I think about nonviolence, not only in ethical terms. It has to be more organic. It has to be a total transformation of how we engage with the world. This is also something very important. We were having a conversation yesterday, and we were saying that I think that at a specific moment, and Sobrino mentioned this too, and I think Leonardo both, and at a specific moment of his life, Jesus must have had a second set of temptations. Jesus had begun to move up north, and he's staying in that north area, okay? And some scholars, this is called the Galilean crisis, some scholars speculate that perhaps at that time, Jesus had the temptation of creating something like a witnessing community up there in the boonies, up there in the north. You know, where you could live a faithful life, you know, and we can witness, but you did not have to deal with Jerusalem. But that doesn't happen with Jesus. It didn't have to happen, but Jesus decides that he is going to move towards Jerusalem. Okay? Jesus does not remain indifferent to a reality characterized by exclusion, abuse of power, and widespread oppression, but rather took a side consistent with the merciful God he knew and with the mission entrusted to him. Jesus sat with the victims and denounced exclusion, abuse of power, and oppression. Denounced the use of wealth that dehumanizes the rich, leads them to tolerate the inhuman poverty of others, and places them in opposition to God's will. Jesus rejects a society structured around a purity system that excludes the most vulnerable, the chronically ill, the lepers, the maimed, and the poor. Thus, Jesus makes enemies of the powerful because he chooses to draw closer to the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the enemies. These confrontations will ultimately lead Jesus to his death. There is a moment that Jesus turns around and moves directly towards Jerusalem, no longer speaks about the kingdom of God, only one time before his death, makes no more miracles, and 3 times he says, they're going to kill me. Okay? He knew what was coming, but he chooses to confront evil, and that for me is a key characteristic. I'm going to be, I don't know how I'm doing in time, but I'm going to be more or less 5 minutes. Okay. So let me move very quickly here. Most scriptural scholars believe that there are 2 symbolic acts that kind of decided Jesus' faith. One is he entering to Jerusalem. You know, if you look at Zechariah 9:10, you're going to see that by sitting on a donkey, Jesus is making reference to a king, to the Messiah. So he's making a claim that he is the Messiah. For those who knew the scriptures, this is a very provocative statement. Second is the prediction of the destruction of the temple, which would have been heard as a threat to the central religious institution because the temple was at the center of Jerusalem. So these actions, combined with his reinterpretation of the law, his messianic claims, led to the capture of Jesus and his eventual death. Now, I think I just want to say a word about the Last Supper because I find some insight there. Drawing from the institution of the Last Supper, different scholars, and here I just mentioned Casper and Skillebeck, agree that Jesus thought that his death would somehow or other be beneficial to his mission and to others. How is hard to tell. It's hard to tell. N.T. Wright makes a more robust case. N.T. Wright is more creative, but I think he's solid. But he makes the case that Jesus uses this final confrontation to model the way of the kingdom and to bring about the kingdom. That Jesus goes ahead of his people and allows for the wrath of evil to come upon himself. And with this, in a way, prompt the intervention of God. Okay? So for Wright, this refers to Jesus, Jesus' death refers to his sacrifice, but a sacrifice understood as a self-donation. Okay? Not, and he's very clear, I quote from him, not an abstract transaction between human beings and their God, but the very concrete expectation of Israel, namely that the nation will be rescued from exile. We're not talking about a transactional atonement here. We're talking about the offering of Jesus' life. Okay? Jesus is crucified. There is no indication that Jesus was organizing a violent revolt, but he might become the focus of revolutionary activity. So the Sanhedrin is afraid of that and they decide to capture him. He's condemned as a pretender, a false king of the Jews, okay? And what I want to emphasize is that Jesus' crucifixion was not part of some divine plan to satisfy God's judgment. So, 5 points about the meaning of the cross. First, the cross is a direct, and this is important, a direct consequence and a culmination of Jesus' faithfulness to God and his solidarity with his people, particularly the oppressed, the poor. So there is no indication that the death of Jesus was willed by God, at least in the New Testament. Second, the cross does reveal two things. At least we can speak of the human sinfulness that it reveals, and Jesus' love for humanity, God's love for humanity, who enters in solidarity with us. The third point I think is important, that Jesus rejects the possibility of a passive coexistence with the forces of evil. And Jesus chooses to confront evil directly, even when such confrontation seems destined to seal his faith and martyrdom. Another very important point. Jesus' ministry is never defined by the violence of the oppressors, but the violence of the enemies. Here, René Girard would be important. Jesus does not imitate, okay, the values, the ideology of the dominant class, of the oppressors, but remains faithful to the way of peace, to the way of the kingdom, to that spirituality. And the last point, it's directly from, well, it's from Sobrino, little massage, but it's from Sobrino. Jesus' whole life reveals that eradicating sin and justice cannot, listen to this, cannot be accomplished indirectly from a distance. It's not enough to sign the check. Okay? and without personal involvement. Rather, it calls for solidarity, for a solidarity that is willing to take up and endure the consequences of sin. That is a love, a compassion, willing to bear the weight of sin and suffer on behalf of others. Okay? It is this coming to the others, and when we come closer to the others, we're carrying that weight, and we are putting our lives in the line. I'm looking at Danny working in the streets, you know, in the garbage dumps. This is what it's about. Well, I teach from a university, but that's another that's another detail. So, I want to remind you of the criteria for martyrdom that we have. And I want to remind you because I want to give you the sense of how inadequate it is. Okay? Martyrs freely accept their death. Their death is violent and is caused by hatred of the faith. I think we need to begin to rethink our understanding of martyrdom. And at least some of the things that I would say are the following. Christian martyrs creatively follow Jesus. Why creatively? Because we live in a completely different context and time. We have different, each one of us has a different vocation, we have different gifts, okay, temperaments. So Christian martyrs creatively follow Jesus and witness to God's reign within a particular historical context, even at the cost of their lives. Their violent death is a consequence of their faithfulness to God and their solidarity with those who suffer. Second, a Christian martyr chooses to actively confront evil. That's a point that maybe Danny and I might argue about later on. Even when such confrontations seem destined to seal his or her faith. Third, the excellence of the martyrs' lives and the superlative faithfulness with which they follow Jesus and the way of the kingdom prevent them from embracing a violent path. I am not saying that violence is not legitimate in the language of the church for a Christian. But I'm saying if you're going to be a martyr, then you have to demonstrate a certain superlative faithfulness to Jesus, a closeness to Jesus. Okay? The other point that I want to make too here is that the dead can no longer be separated from the life of the martyr. We have overemphasized the odium fidei, we have overemphasized just the action of the death, but I think we have to keep in line the whole life of the martyr. In the same way that we rescue the whole life of Jesus, we have to rescue the whole life of the martyr and see how it is the life that leads to the death, to that coherence. So, I propose that martyrs are, in a manner of speaking, a new compassionate creation who exhibit a radical freedom that reflects the hope that God will overcome death and injustice. It's a new spirituality, a new way of being in the world, a compassionate way of engaging the world. And I want to conclude with one little quote from a martyr that for me captures in a few words the meaning of Christian martyrdom, and it's not Monsignor Romero, but a lay woman. It's an extract from Jean Donovan. 2 weeks before her death, she writes to a friend in the United States, she writes, "The Peace Corps left today and my heart sank low. The danger is extreme and they were right to leave. Now I must assess my position because I am not up for suicide. Several times I have decided to leave El Salvador. I almost could, except for the children, the poor, bruised victims of this insanity. Who would care for them? Whose heart could be so staunch as to favor the reasonable thing in a sea of their fear and loneliness? Not mine, dear friend, not mine." Thank you.
Thanks, Ned. That was really rich, and it capped off a really rich session, I think. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. We want to finish by 3, just to make sure people have a good break before the next session. So if you could come to a microphone if anyone has a question. Try to keep it brief, to the point, so that we can fit in a number of questions. So if anyone wants to start, feel free. Bill? Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for that. I want to see if I can get you arguing again. Ernesto, you said right at the end there that a martyr has to actively confront evil, and then you said, maybe I need to argue with Danny about that. So I'm going to ask you, all 3 of you, to address that question. Is there a difference between martyrs and victims? Are all victims martyrs? Are martyrs a subset of victims? What kind of distinctions would all 3 of you make?
So let me begin first, because I was the one who was the I'm really here addressing an idea of John Sobrino, who is perhaps the theologian in Latin America who has written the most about martyrdom. And John Sobrino talks about the masses of people that every single day die out of lack of health, out of starving. He says we need a name for them because they are bearing the consequences of the sins of the first world. We have created this world in such a way that some of us live very well, but for that others are living very badly. So he says we need a name to honor them. They are not like Monsignor Romero, people who went out and sought justice, but they are forgotten. So he calls them, he takes the name of Ignacio de Acuña, and Romero used that term too, of the crucified people. So I would call them the crucified people. They need a name, they need to be recognized and remembered. But I would prefer to maintain a distinction between those who witness actively, explicitly to Christ and the kingdom, because we call them Christian martyrs, but I do, I also know that life is not so clean, but it's messier than that. So, and when I was listening to you, Danny, I was thinking, oh my God, he makes such a good point. So I'm willing to, I'm open to this.
Continue with John Sobrino. John Sobrino speaks about the primordial holiness. So these people who are oppressed and every day get up and search for a living and struggle with poverty and want only to feed their children with spaghetti and for that risk their lives, they have a primordial holiness. So I think some people, like Monsignor Romero, like the Jesuits, are in advocacy for those people. They have a communion with those people, and they try to speak for them. And so they acquire a dangerous visibility that can finish with them receiving a violent death. But the people of the primordial holiness are martyrized every day because of the life they have to live, because they have no option. The martyr, I think the difference is the martyr has a choice, has an option, and makes that choice, he or she, like Jim Donovan, makes the choice of being side by side with the victims. I think I see that difference. I don't know if you agree.
Thank you. What I like with Bill is that he wants the speakers to quarrel among each other. That's a good debate. I know the argument of Sobrino. Sobrino is a good friend. I have read him, and that is respect. But precisely my intention is to explode him, is to go beyond him. For 2 reasons. Number one, I would like to fight against the elitist view of the martyr. that only people who have a choice can become martyrs. In fact, people even for the early part had no choice. Those who proclaimed martyr in the early Christianity didn't have a choice, and if they had a choice, they could have run. Because it's not martyrdom to offer yourself to death. So precisely, martyrdom is like in a border case, to choose in the context of no choice. I don't know if it's that, if that's understandable. But that's my point. The second point is, I think we should interpret love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself in a non-dualistic manner. And both Sobrino and Juan, for instance, tried to express their love of God or faith in God, if you want odium fidei, in the ultimate loving of the other. In the case of Sobrino, or in the case of Ilacurian and the others, so Romero and the others, crucified peoples of Latin America, but in case of Juan, his family. Because Juan also made a choice to go back to his family. He could not have gone back. He could not have gone back. He decided to make a choice. It was the birthday of his child. And his wife is no longer there. He has an old mother, which is 86 years old, and there are 7 children. He wanted his children to be happy, and that the grandmother was saying, they were so happy that morning, because in fact, he was a very loving father. So he made a choice. He knew that area is really wired 24/7. More than the CCTV of Manila Airport. The CCTV there is full-time. And he knew he would be killed. That's why he didn't go back. But on that moment, he went back. So it was a choice. My point is in fact a rehabilitation of martyrdom. Okay, I agree that martyrdom needs choice. Is there a difference between victims and martyrs? I think the choice is important. But the choice doesn't mean like someone who is a religious or who has all the choices in the world. It's a choice to risk my life for someone I love. And I think that's martyrdom. And that's available both for Romero and for Juan, and for us. And when that point comes, and we make that choice, whoever you are, I think that's martyrdom. I'm not sure of that, but I'm trying to explode, trying to make a way to give meaning to a lot of senseless deaths, who's in fact has offered their lives, like the teacher in behalf of her children. Is she a martyr? Of course. She would not be canonized. But is she a martyr? I think yes. The grandmother. And I'm reading about Korean martyrs. There are 10,000 of them. 103 is canonized. 200 plus are blessed. Were they all offering their lives like here? Do they have a choice? Many of them didn't have. But they decided to keep living.
I want to make an exception about where I think John Sobrino models the situation. It's a footnote. But at a certain moment in his argument, he makes reference to Thomas Aquinas, and he says, we could begin to consider or to question whether soldiers are martyrs. And I think he's thinking about those who fought in the guerrillas in Latin America and who gave their life heroically against the dictatorship. For me, that's no problem. Because I do believe that with martyrdom was non-violence. It's deeply.
Yeah, like Dorothy Day struggled against the draft because she believed couldn't be violence in the Christian commitment.
Okay, now we've got some people lining up. Great, thanks, Jim.
Yes. Personally, I believe that Pope Francis has radically changed the understanding of martyrdom in the beatifications of the 17 martyrs of Algeria. So along the line of Danny's presentation, the brother was only a librarian working in the library. The Tibetan monks, of course, opted to stay in the monastery, but they are now in Rabat, in Morocco. Then the sister also was just working in the convent. There were 17 of them who were recently beatified only 2 months ago. And it radically changed precisely the whole understanding of martyrdom by just being there, you see, being present there. And the choice that they've made is to be present there. Something similar to the victims of the extrajudicial killing, that just being there, you see, just being in the list, you see. Just being in the list means martyrdom to them. And it's better going home because of the love of the family is not really the choice that they've made, but rather the very act of putting them in the list made them martyrs. In the same way as you call it inverted commas, the Islamists, put them in the list. They're not political, they're no threats, you see. They're not supporters of the government of Algeria. Of course, they were Christians, but it becomes an affront or a threat, and they will just put them in the list also. Similarly to the 7 martyrs, for example, of the southern Philippines, they were not fighting for justice. One is a treasurer, one was a bishop, of course, the other one, but their names were put there. Gallardo's name was put there. Simply appearing in the list is a martyrdom in itself. So I don't, it's a totally revolutionary change in the understanding of martyrdom that we are now adjusting. So that's why I would prefer, most probably, Danny being a theologian, to write a new theological treatise. Theological treatise. And this change, the change, you see, of the understanding of martyrdom, not simply in the whole enumeration of odius fidei, odius justitiae, odius amoris, you see, totally changed, you see, and perhaps that is what is happening today.
Is that okay if we take that as comment? Yeah. Yeah.
My notes are so chaotic, I won't be able to read through them. Clara actually provided, I think a very contextualized meaning of martyrdom, which is accepting the challenge of staying where they are in spite of danger and threat, and I think that Father Dan is giving that. But the problem is the kind of martyrdom in the Philippines right now is mocked. And so it's wondering, if as Catholics, how do we counter that growing indifference or insensitivity or apathy to or approval of violence brought about by populism, aided by fake news and lies, so that we don't lose the lives of people like Father Danny. Thank you.
Danny, I think that's one for you.
Yeah.
I think the first martyrs in the early Christian community were also mocked. They were a minority, and they were fed to the lions. People were cheering. In the Philippines today, just yesterday, the Duterte has 80% approval rating. And can you imagine? These are 80% Catholics and Christians. Next week will be the election, midterm election, and we're electing senators. And Duterte has a strong party. And if their party wins in the Senate, the whole country is contained. But in the ratings of the surveys, this party is winning. So I think martyrs really are a minority from the beginning up to the end. Yet their witness lives.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you for 3 wonderful presentations. It seems like there's a new phenomenon today that Catholic martyrs are being killed by other Catholics. In the case of Romero, the Jesuits, the Filipinos that are being killed. And maybe not only being killed by other Catholics, but Catholics who think they might be doing the right thing. So it's, opposite or conflicting visions of church. And so there's that dialogue, somehow that dialogue that needs to take place, between the factions within the church, so that, to prevent some of this. Any comments?
Thank you. I would like to remember that in the Gospel, Jesus tells the disciples something about that. There will be a time where you will be condemned and judged, etc., and everyone who kills you will believe to make a service to God. So,
yeah. I just, I think that it's one of the worst evils that we have is a more powerful forces that we have. It's ideology. We are constantly being shaped into a way of thinking, and that way in which being shaped has a purpose. We live in a culture that has certain interests, and somehow evangelization, we have to go through that. If we don't go through that, we're going to be sleeping and then death very soon.
I think the transformation of the understanding of martyrdom can shift from the analytic lens of faith, which was podium fide, to an analytic lens of power, as of this time. Precisely my title is Violent Populist Regimes, and populism is in fact power to control knowledge, power to control discourse, power to control. It's beyond religion, power to control religion, and it's beyond faith. No, it's not one religion against the other. It's actually power to control discourses of people. So I think we need to shift our discourse along the line in order to better analyze what's going on now in populist regimes.
We have to finish by 3, so are you able to do quick questions? Is that okay? Yep. We'll do them together.
I will say thank you. I am deeply moving for your presentation, and I feel your roundtable is unity. It's so really like one team. Yeah. I remember of definition. I think it is from John Sobrino, that poor is the person for who is not normally, that is in the life, and that is witness of God, because it is not Selbstverständlich, normally that is alive. That is what I see in your presentation. It is this Algerian priest of the film of the Dieu et des hommes.
Yeah.
That is this and I will just say, for me, Martyrdom, it is something what bring me near God, and your presentation bring me near with your theology of liberation, but also your. This is I appreciate very this critique of elitism in Martyrdom, because this will bring me.
Thank you. Stan, you want to do a quick one?
A quick one. I'm very uncomfortable with the word martyrdom. Very, very uncomfortable. And I think the last comment by Danny kind of hits at something I think is a new opening that might be considered. So my question is, can we find a new language to express beyond a narrow religious narrative of martyrdom, something that hits at the very core of the crisis that has plagued humanity from the beginning of time, a crisis of violence, hatred, and killing, even the crisis of what it means to be human. We need this kind of humanity to die so that a new humanity can be created. Because we talk about martyrdom from first Jesus Christ. Now we're still talking about it today. El Salvador is not getting better, even with all the battles. So it just seems to me like evil happens, And we now find a narrative to understand, make sense of evil, but we have not found even a transcendent narrative that can really, from the point of view of Christian theology, begin to create an alternative world that might actually be totally different from this world that we now exist in.
Thank you. Do you guys want to briefly respond to either of those?
As long as there is sin, as long as there is injustice and racism and oppression and the way that these are the people who are carrying the cross and are paying the consequences for us. I don't think that liberation theology or martyrdom is going to go out of fashion until the eschaton. Then we will rest. Right now, this is a long and perilous journey.
I totally agree with Neto. I think we have to accept that human life is ambiguous. We are created for fullness of life, for holiness, for happiness, but well, we live in a conflicted world, in an oppressive world, where there is poverty, injustice, violence, etc. And what struck us, perhaps what makes you uncomfortable, and makes me uncomfortable too, is that it doesn't seem to get better. It seems to get worse. So that's what makes us uncomfortable. But well, I think we have to deal with these uncomfortable feelings and be faithful and stick to the testimony of those martyrs, of those people, of this grandmother. I was very moved by this grandmother. I am grandmother. I have 5 grandchildren. And I can imagine a woman of 86 years old with the responsibility of those 7 children, traumatized, shocked with the violence they were victims of. So this woman is a martyr, I think, because she was devastated by what happened, but she was asking strength to God to be capable of assuming this. So those people, this is the primordial holiness that John Sobrino says that dwells in human life, even with the ambiguities that we have. Yeah.
Thank you, Stan. I would like to take it as my assignment. At the moment, I think what's common denominator is a faithful life. And that for me defines martyrdom. We might be not at home with the word, but it's part of the Christian tradition, and as responsible theologians, we have to creatively rethink it. But if there is anything that strikes me as important, it's a faithful life unto death. Now, whatever that means. And I think that grandmother is that what's a life in a martyrial key. That's Roman Logos. And martyrdom is available to everyone. Because if life is in a martyrial key, therefore, it's for everyone to be faithful.
It's a consequence of loving in a sinful world. You have to bear the consequences of solidarity.
Thank you, and thanks to the panelists for a very rich